Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the IFTA Screen Discussions series, putting focus on each of the feature films submitted for this year's IFTA Awards. Every week, we're putting the spotlight on a variety of diverse feature projects representing the best of Irish filmmaking. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by the filmmakers behind Hole in the Head. Here with us today is writer-director Dean Kavanagh, actors Lynette Callahan and James Devereaux, and we'll be joined a little later by sound designer Killian Fitzgerald. So thank you all for joining me today. And I'll start off with you, Dean. The film is by, in terms of the films, I guess, that are a consideration at the IFTAs this year is a bit left field and something people might not, be expecting when they sit down to watch it. So where did your premise for Hole in the Head originate? I read that it was based on a short story that you originally wrote. So sort of where did that come from and how did that develop into being a feature film?
It was based on a short story I'd written a number of years ago. And I suppose I've been working for around 15 years at that point in an entirely kind of improvised manner in filmmaking, working with just, in some cases, professional or working actors, in other cases, just friends and family and things like that. And I wanted to kind of step out of that. I found eventually the improvisational aspect got a bit limiting. And so I started writing a bit more. And I wrote originally short stories. And when it came time to develop one, I picked that one because it was one that engaged with the kind of, I guess, technological aspect of cinema that I'm interested in, particularly analog and film and video formats. And I suppose the desire was to create a story where the visual and the sound could be characters just as much as, the humans that are written in also. So it kind of came from this. And also it's kind of drawn a little bit from, it's an auto-fictional work to a degree. So it's kind of drawn a little bit from the experiences I've had making films over the years, going back to even when I was 10, just very basic means to kind of tell stories and do things in a weird way, I suppose. And the desire was to put all that together. And yeah.
And were you very eager to have this structure with films within the film and using this sort of archive footage and obviously the film that our main character is himself making, I guess, as it allows you to experiment with analog visuals and sound? Was that sort of what drove you to create it in that way?
Yeah. With each format, I was kind of assigning each kind of format a narrative property. So, the 16mm material would be the film John is making. The low ISO stuff, the kind of cleaner 16, that would be the stuff he's finished. The high ISO stuff, the noisier, kind of grainier material, and that would be the rushes that we interrupt. Then the Super 8 material would be assigned the home movie section, and the VHS and High 8 would be assigned home movie also. And then the digital would be the kind of real world. And after I signed them the kind of narrative properties, then it was like, well, okay, I'll give them like a behaviorism. So in Act 1, let's say the 16 material is completely static. The home movie material is handheld, and the digital material, the real world material, is just medium shots, quite like this. Very little kind of focus pulling, or very static. And then as we move into Act 2, it's keeping the narrative aspect fixed, but changing the behaviorism very slightly. So maybe the home movie stuff is on tripod or sticks, and the film that John is making is handheld, and even the digital material could be handheld. And we finally get to the third act. Not that there is necessarily a 3-act structure with this, by the way, it's just to explain it. When we get to the third act, it's all shifted entirely. So I guess the idea behind that and using the formats to tell the story was that I wanted to kind of do the film within the film without entirely engaging with the tropes of like mockumentary. So like, this is the fake film and here's the real kind of moment, having it slowly drift out of sync with itself so that eventually the audience are kind of going along with it, and then they are kind of feeling like they're out of sync. And yeah, kind of putting the internal dilemma or the I suppose the worries and the psychology of the character onto the audience then. So it was kind of designed like that, if that makes sense.
And our main character that John Curran plays is a complete enigma. Like, we never really know what he's telling about himself that's true and that's false. But one of the few sort of truths we see, I guess, is his work as a projectionist. And you've told me before that you're trained as a film projectionist. So was it sort of a no-brainer to you to make that the career of this guy who's himself obsessed with sort of this element of the cinema process?
I've always been obsessed with just the man in the booth. I always found that really fascinating. Actually, my father was a projectionist when I was a kid. And I remember he was a projectionist in the Father Ted cinema in Greystones, actually. And I remember him telling me when Apocalypse Now was released there, it arrived on his shift and all the reels were improperly rewound back to front and in the wrong order. And that film was around 3 hours long. And it was like 30 minutes until it was go time. And I remember that was extremely funny. So I always wanted to kind of do something where you're kind of, the projectionist isn't such a vulnerable space because it's all down to them. So I wanted to kind of bring that into the story a little bit. And I also wanted to give the character of John, who's an amateur filmmaker, also a means to make a living for himself to a degree where he's still interacting with film in a way, whether he's making it or he's, it's kind of a lifestyle, death style for him.
Great. I'll move over to our actors, and I'd love to start with you, Lynette, in terms of how Dean sort of came to you and explained his vision for these characters, because it's an unusual role to have to take up, and there's sort of a duality to the role as well. So how did Dean sort of pitch it to you, and what was it that caught your interest?
Well, when I read the script first, obviously, I mean, I've never really read a script like it, never, yet alone been worked on one or seen one even. So that had my interest straight away. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge challenge, obviously, in playing, playing an actress playing, another person. I knew Dean was quite specific with what I wanted, so I asked him for, examples of what he was looking for, and he sent me some lovely scenes from classic films with Charlotte Rampling, and that's kind of where we started off with the character of Susan. For me, I suppose I was always playing Susan the whole time. I had to make that choice, I suppose, because I'm always playing Susan, who's then trying to find how good an actress she is in playing Helen. So yeah.
And for you, James, what was it that Dean brought to you that sort of gave you material to build this character?
Well, firstly, the spectacles, which made a big difference. Really solved a lot of problems. Actually, were very expressive. But I mean, in terms of the script, it was really we were kind of quite open about it. He didn't give me specific sort of instructions, and we just basically came up with general ideas and sort of emailed them backwards and forwards. And it was during the COVID pandemic as well, so we were kind of in lockdown and just kind of bouncing ideas backwards and forwards. It went on it developed quite a long way from originally the conception of the sort of father character was a kind of Harold Pinter type figure, sort of very brooding, very serious. And as we worked on it more, we decided just to invert that and go for something actually he's quite light and quite engaging, which was kind of at odds with what the background to the character. So that was really sort of the journey of how we arrived at the final characterization.
Okay. And back to you, Dean. I think the film was obviously shot sort of in the last 2 years, so there's this kind of COVID thing hanging over your production. And I think the claustrophobia that's in the house where this film is being made within the plot of the film kind of maybe reflects what you yourselves were experiencing making the film. Did you think filming it during this weird isolated time actually added to the experience of building a claustrophobic scenario like that?
I tell you what, after a while, yeah, you're kind of, everyone is, when the adrenaline wears off after a couple of days, when you finally start eating into the production schedule and everything's going okay, then it's kind of fine. But yeah, certainly towards the end, I think we're all kind of, well, in two minds. We could stay here forever and just do this forever like the character in the film, or, we eventually have to go back to the real world. And I suppose the real world was far more strange than what we were doing. In fact, that's something I really appreciated, was that, no matter I suppose it kind of gave me an extra confidence to approach professional actors like Lynette and James and technicians and crew, to work with people like Killian, for example, was just that the industry as a whole kind of had to slow down to my level. You know, I was doing things in a very DIY way, and I feel that because of that level playing field, I had that extra confidence to ask them to do things that were quite unconventional and to solve problems, I suppose, in the long way around. Where typically in filmmaking or in film production, it's the shortcut, and it's the expensive shortcut is what usually makes it at the end of the day. But I think all of that, and taking advantage of the fact that everything was locked down and was kind of a level playing field, and no one really knew what was the right thing to do, even the government. Yeah, it was really kind of exciting, I suppose. Yeah, there was no wrong way or to execute anything.
Mm-hmm. And back to film, sort of building out our filmmaker character, the most striking thing about him, I suppose, that comes clear a few minutes in, is that he's totally mute, and that he's going to use this sort of robot text-to-speech thing to communicate. And it definitely provides a weird kind of eeriness, but a kind of comedy eeriness to everything he says. But did you make the decision to have him mute to sort of create a deliberate distance from the audience to create unease, or was there other reasons for that? From
the very first draft of the script, he was mute, and there were some early ideas where he might be using sign language. But I suppose I really wanted them to have a voice in some way, and to have a kind of personality through the voice, and again, through devices, through technology. I suppose even if you have all the resources in the world at your disposal, if you can't communicate what it is you want, it's kind of game over. So if there's a message to the film, that's probably it. I mean, that's how we kind of made it. But for that character as well, it enabled us to really concentrate on the silence as well, because a lot of it's so busy. Even when there's silent scenes, you've got the sound of the kind of analog audio or whatever. Just there's not really quietude. But when we get to John alone, he's just very quiet. He's always there. He's kind of omnipresent. And that gave us space to he's kind of like a cipher, kind of moving in and out of the scenes. It gave space for the other characters to kind of come to the fore and attempt to figure him out.
For Lynette and James, was it, whichever of you kind of wishes to answer, was it challenging to be sort of responsible, I guess, for the dialogue-driven side of the narrative? Because so much of what we're experiencing is so visual, and then your characters are actually sort of giving a voice to the audience almost of the absurdity of what's going on. Was there a challenge in striking the right tone with that for either of you?
I think we naturally fell into a good cop, bad cop type vibe, didn't we?
Yeah. You're asking me.
I think ultimately it was very difficult to gauge chemistry. Like when we were doing like all of the prep for this, all the rehearsals for this were in Zoom. So on the page, all the dialogue is just, it's every character typically but John, bar a few phrases. So there was a bit of a lopsidedness to how the balance of dialogue was, considering John is like essentially the lead. But I think that was kind of explored rather well with when we finally got to the location. It all worked, and I was kind of terrified, because it's very hard to gauge anything in a Zoom call. But when we got there, I think all the pieces really kind of fell together. I mean, like James, we had like when we were doing the scenes in the dining room and things like that, there was a lot of time for us just to be present and to kind of think about what it is we're going to do, how we're going to go about it, just in terms of the page, in terms of the lines and where the character is from the beginning of the scene to the end, and things like that.
Killian has joined us as well now. Thank you, Killian, for coming. What for you are the key elements of making a film sound as unique as this does from when Dean initially approached you to work on it?
Yeah, well, hi there, everybody. Nice to meet you, James and Lynette, and yourself, Lucien. Yeah, it was to understand when you first watch this film, code, like ungraded, unsound mixed, anything. It's quite a challenge to understand really what Dean was trying to get at. Did take a few views, did take a few chats with Dean to understand, but I suppose principally two elements really, primarily getting the dialogue to sound right, because it was, while the sound recording itself was a bit up and down, there was also elements like John's machine giving him the voice, and we had to give him a sort of character without coloring it too much. So that was quite a challenge. And then the sound effects, it was just open day for that. We kind of went mad. Luckily, Dean had built up a really good kind of structure, kind of platform where we could hang lots of crazy sounds, and then we get that into a 5.1 surround environment. And it really was like so much fun to do at that time anyway, because we were all locked down and nobody was able to do anything, and this thing comes through your door, and the sort of a period of madness going on outside in the world. And you know, it was a lot of fun to take on, and we really immersed ourselves in it for weeks and weeks. And I'm really proud of the outcome of it. I've seen it in big cinemas and small cinemas, and I've watched it on my phone and listened to it here and there and everywhere. And it translates brilliantly everywhere. And everybody who's seen it, I'm getting messages all the time and calls from people. Actually, I'm getting calls from directors who say, "Oh, I saw your work on Hole in the Head. I'd love you to do my film," which I've just finished a lovely feature documentary about a sheep farmer in Wexford, and that came about through somebody who'd seen Hole in the Head.
There's quite a lot of sheep in Hole in the Head as well. There's quite a lot of, you know, there's lots of links to that. Maybe that was what caught his eye.
It might have been. Yeah, well, we're in Wicklow. Well, we're on the border, aren't we, with Wicklow and Carlow down there where you filmed it. But yeah, so it was a wide experience of craziness, really.
And when you were shooting, Lynette or James, was the shoot of Hole in the Head similar to the shoot in the film in terms of you were in the one place, staying there for a few weeks, kind of shooting your scenes, or were you sort of going home every evening and returning to normalcy and getting out of the weird world of Dean's imagination?
No, it was creepily like the film. We were stuck in this isolated big house in the middle of nowhere with very little reception, and yeah, it was a weird experience, a weird but wonderful experience, like the film.
But without hot water.
Oh yeah,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It got very Withnell very fast. Another thing I thought was quite interesting as well with the fact that we're all there, you know, like for example, Lynette and James are in costume, and then there's some scenes that they are actually just shooting themselves. Like you know, like we block the scene and we walk through it and it's on paper, but you know, it must be kind of strange. I mean, you know, to go into a space like that and film it yourself, you know, to film the scene as a character in the scene. I know James is doing quite a lot of that for one of the big kind of scenes. He shoots it himself. Was that a weird experience for you, James? Like to
I actually find it quite liberating, because when you're acting in a film, you've got the camera on you, and it's like you're under the microscope all the time. Particularly when we did the dining room scene, you know, big long takes. You know, there's kind of feeling of that pressure the camera creates. So when you're actually given a camera and you're kind of be able to run around, just kind of improvise with this kind of camera, it kind of releases you in some strange way from that pressure of being like within the frame with the camera pointing at you all the time. So it sort of deflects it away from yourself in a strange sort of psychological way.
Yeah, that's pretty, yeah. It was great fun watching you guys do that. I'm so much, and the great thing was one of the important things of the production was that all the props in the film had to work, and they had to work in the scenes as they were being used. So there was so much footage of what James was recording or what Lynette was recording or James do. It was quite bizarre to go through it. Like there's so like hours of this stuff.
Something else I thought I caught was the shooting of the actual poster image takes place within the film, right? Where you see them sitting down for the family portrait. And I was like, I've never seen a poster being made within a film before.
That was fun. Yeah, that was like it was the 19th century processed wet plate collodion. We had an amazing photographer, visual artist, Louis Haw. He came in and yeah, he did that for real. Like there was no kind of backup. The sunlight was going, the clouds are coming out. You can really only shoot these with actual, you know, daylight. And then he was, you know, doing the actual darkroom process in front of the camera. and also creating the poster simultaneously. So it was, yeah, it was all about low budget, maximizing the time we had to spend. That was quite scary.
The one significant character we haven't mentioned is the John Allen character, who's the sound guy on the film, inside the film. And I'm wondering, Cillian, did you have any influence on the crafting of that character, or did you recognize some of his bewilderment, I guess, at what's going on in the filmmaking process?
Yeah, he did share a few common traits with sound recordists, location sound recordists. I only joined at the post-production stage, so I wasn't involved with the shoot. But yeah, he was suitably grumpy. He was a bit kind of vague, which may be for various reasons. I don't know why he was so vague and a bit distracted. And yeah, sound guys are grumpy because they spend their lives with headphones on. And when anybody makes a noise, even in the next building, in the next county, it's like, I don't know if you've seen Babylon, the scene in Babylon where they introduce sound and the creaking foot or something. That's why, yeah. But he was great. Didn't get any of his recordings, I don't think, in the actual mix. I think they were all props, were they, Dean?
Yeah, there's some of the, during the scene, it was difficult to have the machine, in that particular scene with John, whenever he's using the reel-to-reels, having the motor run and the tape run, it was quite difficult to run both.
Counterproductive, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We did some kind of, some of the, like, there's no score in the film per se. There originally was an idea, there originally was supposed to be a composer, but I ended up spending all of the post-production money on the shoot because of COVID. And we got a completion grant, thankfully, from the Arts Council to finish it. But then I was kind of left figuring out there's certain sequences that required, actual musical, loose terms, well, what I would think is musical sound, and a lot of the sound I was doing, I was printing out onto tape, and then just kind of messing with the tape, burying it, kind of creating effect, like burning it in some cases. I mean, magnetic tape is kind of interesting. It's kind of indestructible. I mean, there's a shot in the film where John pulls a bucket out of a river with loads of magnetic tape in there, and those sounds are in the film somewhere from that actual tape. Had that buried in my garden for a while as well. And then was running that through like small kind of modular synthesizer kind of thing, and then putting it back in the computer, adding more effects, printing it back onto tape again, and then bringing it to Cillian and kind of going like, well, I've done this thing. And then we're trying to seat it into, the kind of the bed of a sequence.
I think I think all that analog printing really brought a beautiful tone to the audio of the film. It wasn't really a completely digital experience. A lot of it had been analogued, if you like, and brought back in and relayed. And I think that definitely added a tone, a density to the audio of the film.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something about that I think it's more so with visuals, though. For example, I think the kind of detail that you did on the sound was so convincing in some cases, because some of the first people that heard and saw this film, very close friends, would all work in archives, preservation, one or two in sound archives. And we kind of talked to them, oh, was that, Scotch tape, 1985, what condition was that under when you, it's like, no, that was completely manufactured. So this kind of mix, this kind of handshake between analog and digital was quite a pleasant experience throughout, I think. Yeah.
I'm old enough to have actually started my career on film and tape, so it was nice to revisit a bit of that sound and remember it.
We've talked a bit, I guess, about how you sort of pitch the film to these actors and to other artists, and I guess how does it differ when you're trying to explain the atmosphere of the film to, like, when you're getting it financed and when you're trying to market it after it's been screened? Like, what is your approach with something that's this hard to define on paper, I guess, and needs to sort of be seen to be understood in terms of explaining it to people who you're trying to sort of get funding off of, I suppose?
For the funding aspect, the film was funded entirely by the Arts Council. In fact, our budget for this whole film was like 44,096 euros, I think. So that's coffee, toilet paper, and ice cream on a big film. So we made a whole film out of that. The Arts Council were incredible, and I'd been funded by them many times before. And the process really at that stage is just developing the thematic and conceptual ideas that I suppose that make it experimental. Then after that, just, expanding it, once we got the go ahead. But in terms of selling it, it's to be as visual as possible. I kind of had like the posters made. Then I did a lot of kind of small postcards, and then film strips, and then all this kind of stuff to make it as polite and as inviting as possible, to make people kind of want to see. And a lot of time, because we had a theatrical release in the IFI for 2 weeks, and then in Triskel and Cork, and then in the I in Galway. And a lot of people messaged me saying they went to it because they saw, the big standee, and they were like, well, this looks really interesting. And they went, and they just didn't know what, they didn't know what to expect. So just making it as pleasant and as open. And I guess the film kind of does have an emotional core in there in John's character. And I suppose trying to convey that to an exhibitor or to an audience was kind of key.
Right. The final thing we're going to do is that you've sort of prepared a video regarding some of the visual aspects of the film. So just give me 1 second now.
Yeah, I thought this would be an idea because it's sort of hard to, it's hard to put images to. It's much easier just to see what I'm talking about than to. So if you're listening to the podcast version of this, switch over to the YouTube version. But yeah, it's just, I guess it's easier to explain it visually. So I guess, like I said, I really wanted to do a story that involved analog, and I wanted to, as an editor who edited the film, I wanted to edit the film, edit the 16mm and the Super 8mm parts of the film myself, and I wanted to process the film as much as possible chemically myself to get effects like this. And I suppose I wanted it to be an interesting and tactile experience for me, because I was going to be stuck doing it for the duration of however long it took. So we ran out of chemicals pretty quickly during lockdown. So we had lots of plants. We raided every garden around us within 2 kilometers. Sorry if they're listening. And we decided to use, I guess, plants and the chlorophyll of plants and vitamin C powder and all these kind of things you find under your sink to process the film. And here you can see just us attempting our first test, trying to see what kind of flowers and what kind of plants react more than others. If you remember that summer of 2020, actually, it was blazing. So we were quite blessed with not having any overcast kind of conditions. So that was the idea of just, this is all we had available to us. And I wanted these kind of, tactile effects. So that kind of worked out relatively well. Another aspect that I wanted to deal with was I originally wanted the title sequence of the film to be done with an optical printer on 35, but the 35mm got lost in transit and the lab closed in Europe because of COVID. So my friend actually is a furniture designer, and he has a CNC machine in his garage. So we began looking at ways to create titles by editing frame by frame with a laser cutter, a kind of animated title sequence that he would then cut onto the film. We did all this through, the postal service. Unfortunately, the laser, which was quite weak, was too strong. So it just ate through the film. So then we decided, we'll create stencils. So we created hundreds and hundreds of these stencils, like sheets of them, and they all had to be cut out one by one in the order that you see there and applied to the film with tweezers in each frame. And then that will be processed with any kind of chemicals we could find, including the plant-based chemistry. And we weren't really sure if it would work, but lo and behold, this is one of the first tests we ever did. The text actually registers on the film, so it worked. And the phytogram process worked pretty well also. To undertake this, I actually trained to use a Steenbeck, which is the editing table that you see here. Once again, I guess just to reiterate, I really wanted to edit this, as much of it, with my hands as possible, to splice the material together, to use tape, to use all that kind of stuff. And it became a big part of the project, this education. Like, for example, Lucien, you mentioned earlier the fact, like I trained to be a projectionist pretty much so I could shoot the scenes in the booth and I could be somewhat self-sufficient. And the same with the analog aspect. So we're shooting on film and editing on film and trying to process as much as we could on film. And that was another thing, to learn and school up on in order to be able to undertake it independently, I suppose. And I do think like visuals are very different to sound. You can have bad visuals and get away with it, but if you have poor sound, it's over. So when it comes to analog visuals, the digital stuff, in my opinion, doesn't quite cut it for some reason. I wanted it to be real, and I think when you put the time in and you splice it together, it really does have a different feel, a warmth, and a different handmade feel. And again, the character in the film does this, so I wanted to kind of make that kind of realism part of the project. And here's the part you mentioned with the wet plate collodion process. So that's us actually undertaking it there, taking the portrait with James, Lynette, and John. And as I said, there's Louis, and we were trying to do this all live, trying to maximize the time we had. And before we began the project, I really wanted the poster, as odd as it is to conceive a poster before you conceive the work. It's something I shouldn't have admitted to, but I did in this case. And I'm glad it actually worked out, and it became a big moment in the film, I think. Sonically, this is another thing I was mentioning. So there you go. Like there's John taking some of the mag track out of the river that was in there for ages, like weeks. During lockdown, it was amazing because it was so quiet. There was very little noise pollution, and I got to go out and I built like a library of like Foley sounds, like creaking trees and things like that. And of course, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So, 90% of the film is pretty much Foley. Like it was quite, lots of kind of stuff like this, very DIY. So, and there's sand I obviously stole from a building site. That was great until the cat got into it. That was all fine. I thought I'd share this because they're all just the kind of rough sounds I put in, and I'm kind of organizing them. And I've got Cillian in my ear, and he's kind of telling me what he's going to be doing. And then when we get to Cillian, this is Cillian working, and it's just the forensic detail in just manipulating and creating so many sounds and textures in such a forensic way out of the stuff that I brought him and the stuff that he brought himself. It was such an incredible experience. I think half the film is sound. But one thing I'll say though, it's great to have. One thing I was worried about, I suppose, is that I was saying this to James and I was saying this to Lynette as well. That at the beginning I was very worried working with them because working with professionals in general, because I wanted to have this very long way round analog slow process. And I was very worried that experts would kind of come over and go, why are you doing that? Like why like you could just so I was very pleased when they slowly got involved in the project, thought all that stuff was really interesting, and it really helped. I mean, especially Cillian, for example. I mean, he, as you said, like he just leapt at the chance to kind of engage with that kind of sonic world, with that texture. And the idea, like maybe certain actors wouldn't want to be in a scene where they are essentially the camera operator and performing simultaneously. So everyone really jumped on board and embraced this kind of process. So yeah, it's like a big team effort.
Very hard not to be infected by Dean's enthusiasm and crazy visions for what he wanted. It was really a absolute pleasure to be involved with the whole production.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was really insightful. Thank you all for coming and discussing Hole in the Head with me today. I hope anyone who watched this and hasn't got a chance to see the film yet will check it out as soon as possible. It's really impressive and unforgettable. And thank you all so much for coming and discussing it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.